Hello everyone and welcome once again to the Edinburgh Union. It is an honour to have you all here. Just before we get going, I'm just going to do some of the ground rules, just to give you an idea of how this evening works. We have to hear our spectacular speakers who will be giving a 10-minute speech each. In the first minute and the last minute of that speech, they are in protected time, but when you hear the bell, as one of the examples, that means that they are open to points of information which can come from anyone in the room. A point of information should be addressed as a question, and if you'd like to give a point of information, please stand up and quite clearly say point of information or excuse me, otherwise the speakers in their passion for debate might not actually realise that you're there. Excellent. Also, this debate will be available on YouTube afterwards if you wish to watch it or recommend it to friends. After the first 4 speeches, we'll be moving on to 4 speeches. This gives you guys the opportunity to present a short argument if you want. There'll be a 15-minute break beforehand, but keep it in the back of your head if you want to say something. And at the very end, we'll be having a Q&A with all the speakers. With all of the housekeeping out of the way, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all, and the motion before the House tonight is this House believes traditional masculinity is damaging to men and society. The idea of masculinity has shaped how men are expected to behave for generations. It has influenced how men relate to others and how they understand themselves. Now, these traditionally masculine concepts are being called into question. As social attitudes around gender norms shift, now is a time when men's mental health is also a growing concern, and when identity is becoming increasingly politicized. So it is important tonight in this motion that we reflect upon our idea of traditional masculinity and assess whether it does more harm than good. And to start off the proposition, we now welcome Casper Cubitt, a third-year theology student at the University of Edinburgh. Casper, the floor is yours.
Right, magic. I'm a theology student, so I'm really used to being in this hall. Mostly, I am here. I spent countless hours sitting around talking absolute nonsense to whoever will make eye contact with me. So I'm amazed they allowed me back, so thank you. And this time they're giving me a microphone, which is even better. So tonight I'm hoping to break the trend of a lifetime and maybe say something a little bit more coherent than usual. There are no guarantees, however, so bear with me. What I'd really like to do this evening as first speaker is set up this debate very carefully. The motion is quite broad, and so I'd like to specify exactly what we're going to argue as the proposition, as there is a little bit of a danger that both sides will end up talking past each other, and hopefully you as an audience can judge a little bit more effectively whether we have done our job convincingly, so no pressure whatsoever. Before anything, the most important bit is to define what we mean by traditional masculinity. We need a solid definition, otherwise the whole debate collapses. I would like to make it very, very clear that we are not going to argue, or at least I'm not going to argue, against masculinity inherently. Masculine traits like confidence, protectiveness, assertiveness, independence, and physical strength, for example, can be valuable. Again, these are things that are considered to be seen as masculine, but they are not mutually exclusive. These can come from biology or culture or a mix of both, and they are not harmful in and of themselves. Traditional masculinity, however, so the wording in the motion is key, is something very different. It is not simply masculine traits, it is social script, a set of rules which tell men how they must behave and what they must avoid. We draw our definition from the sociologist Raymond Connell, whose theory of hegemonic masculinity is what we would like to think is the leading academic framework in this field. And she argues that traditional masculinity is not some kind of personality type or innate essence. It is a cultural idea, almost a performance that societies have historically rewarded. This is a script that includes traits such as emotional stoicism. It defines worth through dominance. It sometimes presumes heterosexuality, discourages vulnerability, rewards risk-taking and self-reliance, and punishing anything coded as feminine. And this is the definition that we would like to argue by. Most men don't fully embody this by any means, but all men are measured against it in this framework. So this is the traditional masculinity we are debating is harmful. So our claim is simple. This script harms men, harms others, and harms society. And harms a society that keeps on performing it. We're not saying that no good ever comes from it. These virtues can appear attractive, but they do not require the traditional script. And we'd like to say that the harms produced by that social script vastly outweigh any possible benefits that are brought to the table. I won't endeavour to go too much detail when it comes to these harms necessarily, and my colleagues will do a very, very good job of doing that. They'll be pinpointing exactly the sources of traditional masculinity. They'll give systematic reasons why these qualities aren't good, and as well as showing that how this form of masculinity, so traditional masculinity, is dominantly white and has perpetuated racism and other structural hierarchies. However, I'm going to do something different and lay the groundwork for them so they can elaborate further. So I'm going to discuss the two harms that will be relevant, which is harms to men and harms to others. To be blunt, traditional masculinity teaches men to fear vulnerability, because vulnerability in that framework is treated as feminine. And we don't need to guess where this begins. We do see it in early childhood. I'm going to sound very, very monotone as I refer to some studies, but it is important because it does show the evidence is overwhelming in favour of this. There are researchers in the University of Yale and School of Medicine that show that when when young children cry, adults who are confronted by it, they tend to comfort girls, tell boys to be brave or stop crying. By age 4 or 5, they estimate that boys are already suppressing sadness. Or there's more recent work to show that children that don't receive emotional validation grow up far less willing to talk about their feelings. So boys really receive less validation, they learn silence early, and then they carry it into adulthood, as you can imagine. And the clinical evidence in adulthood does confirm this evidence. Study after study on mental health finds this pattern. The more strongly a man feels he must live up to the traditional script, to be tough, to be self-reliant, to never show weakness, the less likely he is to seek help even when he is struggling. So there's research from King's College London that shows that men who identify with traditional masculine norms are significantly less likely to speak to a therapist or a GP. Or there are interviews with men who are experiencing depression, and they reveal the most common barrier to seeking help is fear of looking unmanly. And when you ask men why they don't speak to a doctor or a therapist or even a friend, the most common answer is quite simple, and it is, I did not want to seem weak. That is that social script that we're referring to at work. And so when that sadness becomes shameful, it doesn't disappear. It becomes anger, it becomes withdrawal and self-destruction. And so the consequences are visible in the national data. I don't need to remind everyone that men make up about 75% of all suicides in the UK. And that's not necessarily because men are more naturally inclined to being suicidal, but it's because this script that is set up traditionally forbids them from expressing pain, from seeking help, or admitting some kind of vulnerability. And I think this is incredibly harmful going forward, and I don't believe we should be continuing this whatsoever, or even sort of endorsing it as positive. And then secondly, we've got to address the harms to others. Because that is also an incredibly important thing, because it's not just men, it is everybody else, it is women, it is members of the LGBTQ, it is so many other people, it's society as a whole, it is hierarchies that are being built on this. And so this isn't sort of speculation that it harms these like everybody else. There's research from the University of Michigan as well as University of Toronto that men feel more pressured men feel more pressured to live up to the dominant, this dominant masculine ideal, the more likely they are to express misogynistic attitudes or endorse violence as a way to resolve conflict. Again, it's not because men are sort of inherently violent, it's because the social script does reward this dominance and punishes any kind of backing down. To be clear, this reward I'm referring to is sort of status, respect, attention, and/or power. And so I'm sort of referring to sort of patriarchal issues. The American Psychological Association's Task Force on Boys and Men, that isn't a mouthful, identifies traditional masculinity norms as one of the strongest predictors of homophobic attitudes, because anything coded as feminine is treated with contempt. And the LGBTQ identities get sort of placed on the receiving end of that contempt, sadly. And I think probably one of the most important bits to go to is gender-based violence, because that is the crux of this one when it comes to talking about other people who are most affected, and that is women, and it is how the consequences manifest themselves most of the time. There's strong evidence everywhere from the World Health Organization that shows that endorsement of these traditionally masculine norms that we refer to, especially dominance and control, is a major factor in the perpetration of violence against women. And again, I will reiterate that these behaviours aren't biological, they aren't scripted, they are scripted, they are learned and they are socially rewarded. This traditional masculinity doesn't just shape individuals, it shapes the institutions that we live in. So when boys learn that leadership requires toughness, we build workplaces that reward aggression over empathy. When asking for help is weakness, we create political cultures that value certainty over reflection. And so obviously we're going to get objections that say that this isn't real masculinity, that these aren't real men, that this is not true tradition. I'd like to think that this is a bit of a no true Scotsman fallacy, that you're sort of shifting the definition every time evidence appears against the definition you are working by. So every time we point to harm, someone insists that real men won't behave that way, but that's not offence. We feel that's a bit of a dodge. So if the only way to defend masculinity is to keep trimming away the bits that cause harm, then what's left isn't traditional, it's something new, it's something better, open, more human. And that's exactly the kind of masculinity that we will be arguing for, and that my colleagues will continue to argue for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Casper. And now we'll welcome the first speaker for the opposition, Anna Brown-Turner, a second-year PPE student at the University of Edinburgh. Anna, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. I'm excited to be here tonight. I'd like to first contextualize what we're discussing, and then demonstrate over the next 10 minutes that embracing traditional masculinity offers choice, connection, and productive behaviors in a way that can actually help both men and society. Thus, rejecting all traditionally masculine values causes the very problem that the proposition is trying to critique. Casper, you had an amazing speech, but I want to fundamentally disagree with you on one thing: the definition you're using for traditional masculinity. I think what you're talking about here is toxic masculinity, and that is something very different. Let us understand that values are not one specific thing that are stuck in the past and cannot be changed. Traditional simply means linked to tradition, which could refer to any of the contrasting and evolving traditions that masculinity forms over that changes across time and place. The view of traditional masculinity that the proposition is referring to is a specific model of sexist masculinity that punishes female autonomy and forces men into one specific role. But this version of masculinity is primarily grounded in post-war American upper classes. When talking about traditional masculinity, why should we limit ourselves to the discussion of one class, one decade, and one country? Traditional masculinity meant something very different in, for example, the matriarchal societies of Minangkabau, Indonesia, Riri, Costa Rica, and Akan, Ghana, among many others. or the 160 matrilingual societies that have existed and been documented over the past 1,000 years. In these societies, as in much of history, there is no nuclear family model, and partnerships and leadership between men and women looked very different to how we traditionally imagine gender roles. But who is to say that these are any less traditional? In Britain alone, masculinity variously emphasized sporting achievement, self-improvement, education in the Tudor era, elegance, self-control, and discipline in the Georgian era, sternness and stoicism in the Victorian era, and bravery and self-sacrifice in the interwar period. In his most famous work, Lord Chesterfield wrote to his son about the fine art of becoming a man in the world and a gentleman, extolling the virtues of etiquette, of clean living, of sound morality. Alternatively, American labor leader Cesar Chavez proclaimed that the strongest act of manliness is to sacrifice ourselves for others. To be a man is to suffer for others. God help us to be men. With such a variety of examples of traditional masculinity, why do we default to assuming the worst? Secondly, I want to make clear that I'm sympathetic to the fact that the proposition presents a variety of very serious concerns about violence against women, statistics about male suicide, and male loneliness. These phenomena are concerning and absolutely linked to a phenomenon that many describe as traditional masculinity. We can all agree that patriarchy is bad. Outdated models of society that limit people's societal freedoms to punishing gender roles, where women are stripped of autonomy and forced to abandon their careers and ambitions, is wrong. But a society where men are forced to financially support their families, sacrifice themselves to save the women and children, and are limited for emotional vulnerability is equally wrong. However, I am not trying to push on you this version of traditional masculinity, but rather explore what traditional masculinity means outside of this limited perspective. When traditionally masculine ideas are adapted to modern times and allowed to evolve, it is clear that masculinity can be something to be proud of. Okay, so clarifications out of the way. Why am I standing here arguing against three men in favor of traditional masculinity? Simply put, I believe traditional masculinity can offer men in society choice, connection, and a model of behavior that, however loudly they decry it, many still value for good reason. Firstly, traditional femininity is not inherently harmful, and neither is traditional masculinity. For much of history, I would not have been able to open a bank account or own property and been forced to stay at home to take care of a husband and family. And this is oppressive. Just as forcing men into equally limiting gender roles is also oppressive. But the difference is that we now have choice. Staying home and taking care of a family now is not necessarily oppressive for women, and can in fact be liberating. No, sorry. Gender expression is messy and complicated, but it has much room for good. Expressing a variety of gender identity should not be limited to just one type of man. In the age where the spectrum of gender identity is being embraced in new and freeing ways, it seems foolish to reject an entire type of gender expression that we label as traditional masculinity. Additionally, degradation of women is a failure to be traditionally chivalrous. Being a toxic male is a failure to be traditionally respectful. Not demonstrating control over one's emotions is a failure to be the bigger person. And these are some of the values that traditional masculinity can embody. So today's so-called traditional man exhibits selfishness and insecurity, and that's a failure to be self-confident. It's a failure to put country or family or others first in accordance with many traditions. Traditional masculinity also offers men an avenue for self-confidence and connection that is severely lacking, and this has dangerous consequences. In legitimately criticizing patriarchal institutions and behaviors, we may have over-attacked all versions of masculinity and then have suffered for it. To be clear, I'm not talking about reverse sexism, or denying any of the very real gender inequalities that prevail around the world in different ways. My country has decided to twice elect an incompetent senile felon rather than a woman, and women remain disadvantaged in many professional fields. They're restricted from education and denied human rights in much of the global south. However, significantly more women are graduating from higher education. Men's mental health and suicide statistics remain elevated, and the very type of masculinity that the proposition seems to be attacking, vile, misogynistic men that value the so-called traditional masculinity, is a vehicle for reversing women's rights, and it's actually a symptom of the alienation we have created. Embracing traditional masculinity can in some ways be the solution to the issue of victimization that plagues modern masculinity. The creation of a microcosm of misogyny that the proposition is rightly concerned with, accelerated by the power of the internet, convinces men that they are righteous leaders of the world and that violence against women is the answer. But by fully rejecting traditional masculinity, we have alienated men in the worst way. Traditional masculinity also offers a model of behavior that is one way for how to be a good man and a good human. While it should not be the only version of acceptable masculinity, I think we can all agree that many of the men in our lives could stand to learn something from the lessons of chivalry, of bravery, and of being the bigger man. However much people decry the evils of masculinity, it's something that's still very much valued by women that they're dating, and more importantly, by the expectations people place on their father figures. Often, people are still looking for someone who's protecting them. And when taken to extreme, these expectations can be harmful. This is only one model of how to be a good man. But it's also important to acknowledge that this traditional masculinity presents a version of manhood that many seek, and we should not ignore this. Ultimately, I'd like to remind everyone of an idiom that dates back to the early 1500s. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We must absolutely reject hatred, arrogance, superiority complexes, and unkindness that comes with some perverted versions of modern masculinity. But we must also acknowledge that these traits are not unique to men and they are not inherent to any tradition of masculinity. When separated from misogyny and a singular model of being a man that limits the options of women, traditional masculinity can be something to embrace. While modern masculinity and women hating is a fixed set of values that promotes political radicalization, traditional masculinity can be the opposite. Traditional masculinity presents just one option for how men behave, but it provides a model of community and upstanding morality that, far from harming men in society, can actually heal them. One example of this would be with the so-called trad wives that are taking over many of y'all's feeds. Many people may be criticizing these women, but they offer various perspectives on what it means to be a woman, a wife, and a mother in the 21st century. However, they also present the perfect example of the choice that women now have. As content creators, many trad wives are in fact their family breadwinners. I'm not going to defend all of the narratives that these creators spread, but instead I want to point out that the traditions of femininity and masculinity are often complex, and the choice that is offered in today's society should not be limited to exclude all of that traditional masculinity has to offer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And now we welcome the second speaker for the proposition, Rupert Sneed, a second-year PPE student at the University of Edinburgh. Rupert, the floor is yours.
Adjust this mic a little bit for my
Yeah, feel free to pick it up as well.
Oh, great. Actually, okay. I cannot stress how important this debate is in our current political climate, and I thank the President for bringing it to the Edinburgh Union. I also thank Anna for her very eloquent speech, but I'm worried about the issue of definition here. She talks about that we're mentioning the toxic masculinity, the sexist masculinity, a post-war American masculinity, although not everything is about the US. We're talking about versions of masculinity, but as Casper warned, this is dodging. This is the no true Scotsman's fallacy. But I will accept the challenge. We can reject all the cons of toxic masculinity because the cons are obvious. But let's just focus on the pros that they've just mentioned. And I've quoted them. To be the bigger person, suffer for others, and mentioning things like stoicism as positive things. As Casper brilliantly put, masculinity is hard to pinpoint, especially from my position against traditional masculinity and gender as an entire structure that we live by. It is often ridiculed, as often studies of gender are. This is because we lack the language and general impetus to make this easy to understand. Gender is so ingrained into the English language and our upbringings that we cannot imagine a society without it. A recent interview between Piers Morgan and Zach Polanski is a brilliant example of this. Morgan asks, "Do you think a woman can have a penis?" And Polanski says yes. Morgan ridicules him, saying that woman is a biological term. Morgan is wrong, as any argument that artificially simplifies science inevitably will be. But yet, in our head, he sounds right. We find this contradiction between the word woman and the word penis because of our language binary. But penis is a biological term and woman is a societal term. Thus, any meaningful stance on gender can be torn apart by fallacies like Morgan's, which turns debates like this into a cesspit. Tonight, I'm going to avoid that cesspit. I like being a man. I like
I believe it's given me great privilege, and I know it's not just about phalli and testosterone. As I said, there's no point pulling down masculinity for its toxicity or entering the sensational trans debate, because the opposition will just dodge away from it. I will instead turn to what the opposition has called the good of masculinity. This is because the norms of sexuality and gender serve power, not people. Traditional masculinity is not an eternal biological truth. Qualities that we associate with it, such as emotional suppression, dominance, strength, are produced through historical processes, even the positive ones. And what it means to be a man today has been shaped by medical discourse, military discipline, labour needs, state governance, and religious morality, to name a few. At no point in history has it been constant or globally ubiquitous. European traditional masculinity has been a tool for control, no matter how good we believe its qualities are. And I'm going to give 3 points to illustrate my case here. And that case is that the sources and reasons for traditional masculinity cause a social hierarchy that keeps men subservient and useful while simultaneously making men feel powerful. The first is masculinity's role in state governance as a form of discipline, to pacify both men and women and limit social change. I mention women here because you cannot talk about masculinity without mentioning femininity. It's a dialogical binary system. If men are strong, women must logically be weaker than them. And ancient Greek culture is a good beginning point for this Western masculinity. Anna spoke about America being the start of where we're coming from here, but being a proper man in ancient Greek culture has been morphed from today. So it required rigorous self-control over one's body, desires, and emotions, and it was something that was performed through discipline, not something you simply were. Stoicism, in particular, was central to this suppression. And men today are still expected to master themselves and deny vulnerability. Again, this is a part of the pros of the qualities that we have. But this demand is not a natural one. Nothing about our physiology as men causes this. Rather, it is a historical moral code that connects manhood to hierarchical superiority and protects power. It benefits the state by creating compliant workers and soldiers, benefits patriarchal institutions like the military by training men for dominance, and contains social change by discouraging men from seeking help or challenging hierarchy. It has persisted because it has always been in the interest of institutions and governments to do so. These qualities, however, do not benefit men, they limit their humanity. I think a simple and visibly excessive example we can use here is Nazi Germany. But all Western states have used and sometimes required these methods in some form to survive. Before Hitler, Germany was an incredibly liberal society under the Weimar Republic. But the Nazi regime reinstated strong traditional gender roles and disseminated them through groups like Hitler Youth. This was not for the benefit of strong, independent men, it was a tool for population control. Hitler Youth entrenched valuable ideals into young boys through militaristic discipline, emphasis on bravery, endurance, and the rejection of weakness. It cultivated this through uniformity, and socialization aimed at preparing boys for national service, fighting and dying for the fatherland. Girls in the League of German Maidens were socialized into domestic roles to maintain the German race and were even given medals for giving birth to more babies. Now, this masculinity, inherited from the ancient Greek and Christian morality, was weaponized to regulate society, was to reinforce domination and perpetuate violence. Hitler needed a population willing to work for his national effort and later fight in the war. And by emphasizing hierarchical labor systems and family organization, the Nazi regime was able to supercharge national identity, whereby men are defenders of the state. The positives we are talking about when we talk about traditional masculinity are then used by state power, by governments, by institutions to weaponize it as a tool for brainwashing, I'd argue. These uses of traditional masculinity appear extreme, but are purposely integrated into all state societies, not just dictatorships, including our own. And Dr. Curry will go on to say why Britain in particular is a very important case for this. My second illustration of the venomous sources of our masculinity will be militarization. War shapes masculinity, and masculinity shapes war, to the point where the military becomes a national end in itself. Being a soldier is an awful reality. You are around what counts as a real man, and shames and marginalizes those men that don't conform. This is drawing on from what Casper mentioned. This produces intense stigma around male nurturing, creativity, or emotional expression, so far as that men end up policing each other as proof of their own masculinity, an internalized system of surveillance that greatly harms the individual and wider society. This is not because effeminate men are any stupider or gay men any weaker than the traditional masculine, but rather because it is not in government and institution interest. and thus is better discarded. Masculinity is tied to political agendas. No matter how good the qualities themselves are, it is tied to political agendas. When men are trained for dominance and emotional restriction, it breeds resistance to social change, rigid gender hierarchies, homophobia and transphobia, as these non-traditional masculinities threaten the order that the status quo must maintain to stay in power. I must remind us all that masculinity is not a biological truth. Terms like heterosexuality did not exist until the 20th century. Blue was a gauge colour until World War II. I will finish, because I'm running out of time, by saying that I am hopeful for society, but also doubtful. The past couple of decades have seen the absolutism of gender stripped back, and the life of a gay man, for example, is easier than it has ever been before in this country. Feminine qualities in men are slowly, albeit very slowly, becoming more mainstream. However, we have a long way to go. Transphobia is increasingly extreme, with government impetus to exacerbate it, all despite the fact that anti-trans lawmakers and protesters have likely never been well acquainted with a trans person. They still vehemently battle it. But this is entirely down to traditional masculinity. Trans women in particular are in exact opposition to the masculinity that maintains hegemonic order and restricts social change. I think, though, that these arguments are failing, and we are slowly starting to realise, however wrenching it may be from the core of our own identity, that gendered roles are nonsensical. I would prefer a debate without them. I prefer a world without them. Mr. President, I could be more proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Rupert. And now we will welcome the second speaker for the opposition, Ash Barker, a fifth-year mathematics student doing an integrated masters at the University of Edinburgh. Ash, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, when I stand here today talking about traditional masculinity, I imagine you're thinking of strong and violent men imposing their power and treating their emotions like state secrets. But before I condemn it, before we condemn it, let me again approach this question of what does it mean to be traditional? You see, if we equate that to what was 100 years ago, then by all means condemn traditional masculinity. But in reality, there's more to it. You see, tradition is that which endures, a foundation whose presence has been found throughout time. And with this understanding, it's simply not enough to point to one decade or one culture and take that as a standard. No, we must dig deep into the essence of morality, into its moral fibers, and ask ourselves, beneath the surface of changing politics and shifting cultures, what are the values that have truly stood the test of time? Because masculinity is not a set of static ideas frozen in history. It is a living family of values and traits adapting to the times and cultures in which they exist. And yes, these values are adapted, corrupted even, but the underlying ideals have remained remarkably consistent and remain remarkably important. Let us begin by considering early human societies, where contrary to popular belief, gender roles were far more fluid and cooperative, with men and women both participating in hunting, gathering, and community life based on skill and need. It was only as these civilizations developed that these roles became more rigid, and with it grew the constructs of masculinity and femininity. These were socially constructed ideals, defining the behaviours expected of men and women. In the classical periods, the warrior ideal gave rise to values of courage and honour. Then during the Industrial Revolution, masculinity adapted, now to be defined by perseverance, cooperation and rationality. Yeah.
Was that only in benefit of the people who wanted people to work in their factories? If men are very good at working in factories, then surely that's the best idea of all that.
Yeah, but at the moment I'm trying to set a groundwork of where these traits are coming from, and later we'll go into the fact that these don't just have to be masculine traits adopted by men, they can be adopted by anyone. But the values themselves are good. Cooperation is a good fit. So these changes continued into the world wars where stoicism and moral duty were held as young men went off to fight for their countries. Yet despite these changes, consistencies exist across times and cultures. Whether it be the samurai of Japan guided by Bushido's guide of code of discipline and honour, or the classical Greek ideal of a rep which promoted excellence of the mind and the body, there are recurring themes. strength, courage, discipline, honour, leadership, independence, and stoicism. Now, in balance, I don't think anyone here would disagree that these are values that men and women can and possibly should strive for. So I ask you, is it really traditional masculinity that the proposition hopes to condemn tonight, or is it rather the corruption of these values? Because yes, just like any other human construct, masculinity can be taken to extremes. Aristotle reminds us in his Doctrine of Means that every good thing lies in balance between two vices. So courage lies between cowardice and recklessness, leadership between indecision and tyranny, and discipline between indulgence and obsession. So you see, it is when masculinity strays from this balance, when it indulges its extremities, that it becomes harmful. But this distorted adaptation is not traditional masculinity, it is merely a corrupted offspring. Now I know what you're thinking. If traditional masculinity is the root of these corrupted masculinities, surely it's still to blame. Surely it is still damaging. But to that I say, to blame traditional masculinity for the extremes it can produce is like blaming the roots of a tree for a few rotten fruits. If a tree grows in poor soil under harsh conditions, then it may bear bad fruit. But that does not mean that the roots themselves are corrupted or poisoned. It is the conditions in which masculinity finds itself in that cause the corruption and damage, and which damage men and society in today's world, not the values themselves. Because for every rotten fruit, for every corruption of masculine values, there are countless good fruit. The courage of those who fight tyranny, the endurance of those men and women who work hard for their family, and the leadership of men and women who stood up and continue to stand up for justice in the face of danger. These traits too are born of traditionally masculine values. So if traditional masculinity is not to be blamed, then what is? What causes these corruptions that damage men in society? Well, there are many causes. Stress, social and economic pressure, and uncertainty, to name but a few. But again, much like masculinity, these causes change and adapt over time. In the past, rigid social hierarchies and narrow social cultural expectations played a big part. Today, I would contest it's more a case of fear and uncertainty. You see, in a world of increasing fluidity in gender roles, and where identities are being redefined, some men find themselves fearing the loss of their own identity. And what is their response? They double down, reject any form of femininity, and embrace the extremes of masculinity. And the lack of visible role models who promote and demonstrate a balanced approach to masculinity doesn't help the problem. Into this void steps false prophets, the likes of Andrew Tate, who push a cheap, corrupted version of masculinity, built on ego, power, and dominance. But this is not traditional masculinity that they're selling. They're merely selling insecurity. Because the truth is this: masculinity and femininity are not two opposing armies. They're two interwoven threads of the same human tapestry. They're not enemies to be fought, but rather energies to be balanced. Both possess honest and important core values, and yes, both have their extremities, but the beautiful thing is that somewhere in between them lies the essence of humanity. And in the modern world, masculinity and femininity are truly genderless terms. Though they're labeled as capsules of a time past, their contents, values, and ideals still hold just as important today. So let me be clear. This debate is not a question of the label traditional masculinity and the consequences it might carry, but rather it is a question of values, of the essence of traditional masculinity and its point in the modern world. Because in the modern world, masculinity and femininity will continue to evolve and adapt, but their foundational values will remain essential. Because it is not traditional masculinity that is damaging men in society, but it's corruption and misunderstanding, pushed and driven by a loud minority, caused and shaped by external factors. So I urge you, do not throw away the roots because a few fruits have rotted. Rather, provide those roots with the care and conditions they need to thrive. Do not reject strength, honour, and discipline because some have chosen to misuse them. Rather, embrace them in balance and combine them with the values of traditional femininity. And finally, take heed to the words of of American writer and civil rights activist James Baldwin, who so beautifully described the importance of balance when he said that love between any two human beings would not be possible did we not have available to us the spiritual resources of both sexes. Traditional masculinity, in its true and balanced form, is not a threat to society. It is one of its cornerstones. And for that reason, I stand firmly against this motion. Thank you.
We will now have a brief break, and afterwards we will move on to floor speeches, which gives any of you the opportunity to speak on this particular topic. So we will have a 15, we will meet back here at 9 o'clock. My watch is out. We will meet back here at 8 o'clock. And please reflect on what you might say in the meantime. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you very much. We are actually just going to do floor speeches first before we move on to you. The excitement is incredible. I love what you've done with the furniture as well. Do we have anyone who would like to speak from the floor? Hand went straight up there. So you can take the microphone there. That's fantastic.
Thank you. I have a point of information for opposition. Don't you think that traditional masculinity is reinforced by authoritarian ideologies?
Just for this, because this is meant to be more sort of individual speeches, what we'll do, we'll come back at the end of the Q&A and we'll come to you first. That's okay?
Sure.
Does anyone wish to add? Excellent. Hand over there. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, I think I can notice. Excellent.
Thank you very much. It's interesting to see Rainy Hall being used as a serious place. I'm a divinity student. This is normally a cafe for very unserious conversation, so it's quite nice to see a bit of a different tone of things. Divinity students are largely known for two things. The first is our incredible building, and perhaps is the mockery we make of non-divinity students, often politics and IR students, for taking the easy way out. And I'm concerned that you guys are agreeing too much, so I'm going to give you something to disagree about. It seems to me that both proposition and opposition are broadly agreed on what we have termed as traditional masculinity is good and is bad. And the term of traditional masculinity can be debated in terms of whether that is traditional according to large generalised sweep readings of history, but broadly there's an agreement on that. And there broadly seems to be an agreement that our notion of masculinity ought to be accountable in some way to prior interpretations that have gone before. And there's a risk here that we just present two rather different generalised sweeping interpretations of how we are to read previous interpretations of maleness in order to account for our own. But broadly, you're arguing for the same thing, which is a reflexive, progressive, traditional reading of masculinity. So let me give you something to disagree about. What actually is a man? What is maleness? Because we are arriving at different conclusions on how traditional, prior, accountable to the past interpretations are to inform that, but the system of how we're framing maleness is broadly the same. So if maleness is to be reflexively, traditionally accountable to something, let's actually nail down to brass tacks on what that is, because you've skirted around it in a few places. There might be aspects of the proposition side that would trouble the whole notion of masculinity entirely, that maleness ought actually to be a category that we no longer use, in which case both baby and bathwater are to be rejected in favour of a better way of viewing society. Whereas the proposition actually have not given me an understanding of how I am to navigate tradition to account for what it is to be male. And if you are to present a tradition, large generalised sweeping views of history gives me no canon of interpretation to make sense of that. Where am I to go to read the past? So, disagree on something, please.
Thank you. It's funny actually, one of the last times I was here is in my first year, where I was a philosophy and theology student, and then I ended up switching to business.
and I'm here in my 4th year, so it's nice to be back. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, this is a really interesting debate because essentially every problem we have in the world is in some way affected by the way in which we see men and the way in which we see women interact. And there's so many different ways to explain it. And I think it's good we should start at the very question of maleness, right? I think the proposition, those who believe that traditional masculinity is in some way failing men and failing society, I think they're wrong to suggest that biology doesn't play any part. We all know that men ultimately have a different biology, a different physiology that affects the way in which they interact. It affects their impulses. High levels of testosterone contribute to high levels of aggression. What I'm trying to say here is traditional masculinity teaches men how to control their impulses and channel them in a way that is good for society, that is good for men. For example, the whole concept of testosterone producing more aggressive traits. What those in favour of traditional masculinity believe is that that aggression can be used towards strength and protection. The idea that what we're doing with the natural tendencies can actually be a good thing. I want to also talk about male suicide because it's a very important thing. I think the reason why this is becoming such a big problem is because men have lost purpose today. And I think that part of the reason men have lost purpose is because they find that there is no purpose within themselves, within the way that they, as a man, are feeling. And I think that attacks on masculinity, attacks on the self that a lot of men want to represent themselves by, ultimately is a bad thing because it leaves men with no purpose and no hope. So I think traditional masculinity is something that should be supported. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello. I'd like to make an argument somewhat in favour of the opposition, so against the proposition. Mainly in regards to an argument of proposition made about masculinity being an inherent trait of a military organisation and how the military is, in fact, a negative thing and damaging to society. To contextualise why I'm making this argument, I would like to point out that I am somewhat biased as I am a second lieutenant in the reserves currently, so I am in the military, and I would argue that the military is not in fact inherently masculine. In fact, nowadays it has been shown that femininity is a fantastic thing in the military, and the military benefits from women in the army. Being in the army does not in fact strip anyone of a femininity, whether they be male or female. In fact, it is much more feminine than people are led to believe. This is because the managing and the respect you need for your fellow people, be them the enemy or your own colleagues, is something that could be argued to be traditionally feminine. You need both. More broadly, I believe that traditional masculinity is not damaging to society because much like traditional femininity is not damaging to society. You need both. Femininity and masculinity are just two things that make us human, in a sense. So yes, I think that makes sense, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the argument.
Does anyone, since both of those last ones were speaking in favour of traditional masculinity, would anyone like to oppose the motion? No? No problem, we can move on. Next we return to our main speakers and now to our guest speakers. So we are pleased to welcome the third speaker for the proposition, Tommy J. Curry, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. Professor Curry has held the personal chair of Africana philosophy and black male studies since 2019. His book, The Man Not, Race, Class and Genre and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, won the 2018 American Book Award for its discussion of black masculinity. And Professor Curry is considered by many to be the father of black male studies, as he is the editor of the Black Male Studies, a series exploring the paradoxes of racially subjugated males, which is the first book series to ever be dedicated to the field. Professor Curry, it is an honour to welcome you to the Edinburgh Union, and the floor is yours.
I appreciate the honor, and as I said in Cambridge last week, I don't have enough time because I have a lot of arguments to cover. All right, so I'd like to begin with an insistence on historical context and conceptual clarity in our discussion about masculinity. The first oppositional speaker wants to argue that masculinity of revolutionaries like Cesar Chavez should be put into the category of traditional masculinity, completely ignoring that people called him a savage and fundamentally believed that racial groups and revolutionary partisans were in fact feminine, which is why they did not raise the level of civilization. They didn't try to play word games with it, trying to say that there's been over 160 different matrilineal societies, but they can't give you an account of the masculinity of one single one of those. So they'll tell you, hey, we have all these different traditional kinds of masculinity, but guess what? You didn't study it. You want to know why? Because European societies did not believe they had civilization. They did not believe they were worth studying. They did not believe they had didn't have the same kind of religion, the same kind of language, or the same kind of apparatus for which they believed that there should be sex roles. They were not fundamentally men, much less human beings. So do not let them get up here and play this reflexive 21st century moment where everything could be masculinity if we think about it hard enough. Now, the first words uttered by Enlightenment theorists concerning the nature of European man in the Anglophone world insisted upon a difference between the white European man as the pinnacle of evolutionary development and the black African man as the savage origin of the species. So in 1813, James Kyle Pritchard, who was actually a University of Edinburgh alum and considered the father of British ethnology, remarked that in the human species is the transmutation of the characteristics of the Negro into those of the European, or the evolution of white varieties and black races of men. We have seen that there are causes existing which are capable of producing such an alteration, but we have no facts which induce us to suppose that the reverse of this change can in any circumstance to be effective. This leads us to believe and to infer that the primitive stock of men were Negroes, which has every appearance of the truth, end quote. Now, the opposition to argument concerning masculinity presumes an ignorance of the ethnological origin of European sciences of man, which were endeavored upon by European countries and empires throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries. So traditional masculinity was the outgrowth of civilization and culture and was a central concern for Enlightenment thinkers from the 1800s all the way to the 20th century on both sides of the Atlantic. Men of bell letters asserted that through Anglo-speaking world that white men were the only stocks of man ordained to rule the world and walk upright with their eyes up towards the heaven. In 1861, the renowned ethnologist John Van Every, in fact, actually argued, and this is a crazy quote, so forgive me, the intellect, the mental strength, the moral beauty, and all the qualities of inner being, as well as those outward attributes tangible to the senses, harmonize perfectly with the growth of a beard. And when it has reached its full development as both a signal and proof of mature manhood, an exact admonishment of absolute proof of maturity of the individual, as well as the standard of the typical race. This is equally true when applied to different races. The Caucasian is the only bearded race, but all others approximate in this respect, and the Negro is furthest removed of all. For the tropical woolly hair of the African Negro is set with a little tuft on the chin, mine's got a little gray, and sometimes the upper lip has nothing that can be confounded with a beard. Now, a year earlier than 1861, in 1860, Samuel Cartwright actually argued that black men and racialized men were not in fact men at all, but rather beasts of the earth, what he called Nahash, a servant of the devil, while the white man, on the other hand, was in fact created by God, a son of Adam, a superior race, Nefesh Hayah. Insisting that the British theologian Adam Clarke's interpretation of Genesis was incorrect, Samuel Cartwright asserted that the creature which beguiled Eve was an animal formed like a man, who walked erect and had the gift of speech and reason. He believed it was an orangutan and not a serpent, but if he had lived in Louisiana, not instead of England, he would have recognized the Negro gardener. Masculinity was a criterion for civilization for over 200 years. As Eleni said in 1881, in an edition of Popular Science Monthly, the white races of Europe evolved into patriarchal societies, where masculine attributes exceeded that of feminine. Savage races had lesser men, who were in fact ruled by their women, or, as Delani writes, quote, man excels woman among the European races. This is not the case in inferior races, where the feminine sex is more vigorous and more intelligent than the masculine. Now, the second speaker wants you to believe that there are fluid gender roles, and in every civilization, right, that we've seen balance. He forgot one word, Europe. That was not the evolutionary pattern of European civilizations. In fact, there's no record of egalitarianism within a modern European society in almost 200 years of documented ethnological science, many of which was conducted here at the University of Edinburgh. They want you to believe in fluidity because that fits your contemporary sensibilities. It appeals to your 21st century identities, the way that you think about masculine and feminine, but that's not the debate. The debate is not who can define traditional masculinity based on people's individual sexuality. The debate is whether traditional masculinity in fact harms societies. And they have not proven that traditional masculinity, the masculinity that dominates the ideological components of the society, the masculinity when you wake up and say, what do you want a man to be? And the little boy says, I want to be a capitalist, I want to be a baller, etc. Those are the ideological components that RWS Kano wants to address. They haven't addressed that. They're going to tell you that's toxic masculinity, but Kano doesn't even believe in toxic masculinity. In fact, in the Time magazine article, she recently argued that the notion of toxic masculinity that's made its way through America and Britain is based on a false assumption. Hegemony is ideological. Toxicity is about violence. The definition that the first speaker on the House read explained that hegemonic masculinity is an ideological function that's conducted on the basis of wages, ideology, and private property. It's not about the hand or the force of a gun. So philosophers and ethnologists saw masculinity as a particular and enduring form of European races. Now, I find it funny that the second speaker says for us to truly understand what masculinity, traditional masculinity is, we have to dig, but he didn't offer you a single historical reference beyond his reflective poetry of Baldwin. It is the foundation on which nations, government, and families were represented throughout the world. It was, in fact, the very lineage of the family that inspired Thomas Macaulay to say in 1860 that it is only among civilized races of men that women are loved and protected. He did not claim that it is only the British who may in fact say that, quote, the interest of a respectable Englishman may be said without any impropriety to be identical to that of his wife. What we never know is traditional masculinity was not primarily the division between man and woman. It was a racial division, a chasm between kinds, where those who could not touch Europe were in fact terra nullius, lands without people, people without cultures, and races without men. These ideas were not fringe. They shaped immigration policy, anthropology, imperial administration, and modern criminology throughout the 20th century. And it's the violence towards these other groups of men, of racialized men, that actually established the boundaries and the ground upon which ideology and hegemonic masculinity would come to live. Now, I want to make a few distinctions. First is in-group versus out-group allegiances. The opposition makes claims about the value of masculinity, but they don't tell you who that virtue applies to. The argument on the House's side is you're right. Men can be courageous. Men can be brave when they're protecting their racial own. But when those men are soldiers and they're courageous and brave and they're slaughtering groups of people from other countries, other cultures, and different complexion, is that traditional masculinity beneficial? Is that the traditional masculinity you want to preserve? Said differently. When everybody's white, good masculinity takes care of everybody, women and children. When you start adding blacks and Muslims, it gets a little messier, a little more bloody. Traditional masculinity has been shown to be a hegemonic idea that's accepted throughout society based on its ideological power, its ability to dictate and determine norms of gender relations within a particular society and for a specific group. R.W.S. Connell, a leading world masculinity scholar, was clear that her accounts of hegemonic masculinity are isolated to the histories and structures of gender relations in modern capitalistic societies. In fact, she explains in her book Masculinities that it is built on the conception of individuality developed by early modern Europe with the growth of colonial empires and capitalist economic structures. Now, the second speaker for the House explained that masculinity shapes war. This is absolutely correct, but the opposing teams try to convince you these traditional masculine norms have positive values like protection, service, and sacrifice. The social biologist Pierre Barrett explained that while intra-group relations are primarily dictated by kin selection, real or putative, inter-group relations, groups between different racial groups, are typically antagonistic. There's an open competition for and conflict over scarce resources, and not infrequently the establishment of multi-ethnic states dominated by one group at the expense of others. Masculine ideals within Western societies, the Anglophone-speaking world, masks coercion within interracial relationships. This shift from intra-group paternalism to the liberté, égalité, and fraternité ideals, which are characteristic of the various democratic ideologies of industrial societies over the last 2 decades, raises a question as to why tyranny has increasingly been justified through appeals to freedom, equality, and brotherhood when applied to different groups of men, women, and children who differ in complexion and color. The benefits of masculinity within a society are primarily directed towards in-group members. not out-group members. As policy Bryson has explained in the racial hierarchy, top males in Western societies keep other males down, undeveloped and out of circulation. The late Harvard professor of psychology, Jim Sedanius, makes a very similar point. He says that this arbitrary set aggression are how in-groups socially construct out-groups, how we construct out-group men as terrorists, out-group men as rapists, out-group men as fundamental criminals, is a fundamental component of traditional masculinity. It creates the objects that they believe the society should have men act courageous to. So if you have a foreign invader, traditional masculinity looks courageous when you kill the invader. But that is a fundamental part of the out-group scenario that's brought about with traditional masculinity. The real issue here is to protect one's kind and to be caring for strong people as men in Western societies that are dedicated to eliminating the male threats which justify war, genocide, and apartheid to maintain the courage and safety of families in homogenous European societies. Thank you.
Very much, Professor Curry. That was, I think, what can be described as a tour de force or a minute taker's worst nightmare. And now we move on to the third speaker for the opposition, Colin McFarlane. A former professional football player, Colin has spent the last 3 decades in community development and youth mentoring, beginning his career in the Prince's Trust before moving to the Young Men's Christian Association, more famously known as the YMCA, while working on the university degree in community education. Since 2015, he has been the National Programme Director of YMCA Scotland's award-winning Plus One programme, which he helped design and pilot. The Plus One programme mentors young people who are on the verge of entering the criminal justice system, and as the Programme Director, Colin has supported the international growth of Plus One into both Canada and Ireland. Mr. McFarlane has also been prominent in the creation of the Scottish Healthy Masculinity Alliance, which was started last year. Colin, it is wonderful to have you here at the Edinburgh Union, and the floor is yours.
And there's lots of really, really amazing discussions happening tonight in terms of academic stats and facts and definitions around the traits of masculinity or what masculinity is and what it means. I'm not going to talk about that. For me, I'll try and talk to you a bit about, and hopefully this is my first ever debate in quite a long time of being involved in this type of work. I've never done a debate. So I'm actually going to ask you to do a wee thing at some point during this chat. I'm really interested in the point you mentioned about what does it mean to be a man? My question back to you is, why do we have to define it? My point is that this idea about being a man has changed so much, particularly in the last decade. A quote from a friend who spent a number of years in Berlin and then got to a really prominent position in the WISE group, Charlie Martin. Charlie said to me, Colin, it was such an interesting time. He says, society's moving at the fastest pace it ever has, and today's the slowest it will ever be. So our culture, our society, our economics, our lives, our fundamental lives are changing on such a regular basis that for me, we can't justify what was historical aspects of being a man or masculinity and impose them on where we're at just now. For me, where are young men nowadays? We hear about Andrew Tate, we hear about Jordan Peterson. We're going to ask you to spend the next 30 seconds and think about the last time you heard a positive story about a young man on social media, in the press, or in any journals. So spend 30 seconds. Better time. And just by a quick show of hands then, can anybody tell me the last time put their hand up when there was a good positive story about a young man? One, brilliant. Two up the back. 3, 4, 5, 6, we're getting braver. 7, 8, 9. Call it at 9. That's less than 10% of our audience. So we frame young men as bad, which has led us to the rise of toxic masculinity. So why am I involved in this work? I got involved in this work 10 years ago because I'm a husband to a fabulous wife. I have a daughter who's 20, and we've got 2 wee guys at 12 and 16 growing up in my house. And I want them to have as many opportunities as I've had during my life. Because I think society's down on men. I think society's challenging men right now. Has there been a rise in gender-based violence? Absolutely. Is there a rise in young men's perceptions? When I was growing up, there was no such thing as an incel. So what do you mean you couldn't get a girlfriend at the community centre disco? We've actually created a culture or a term for men to recognise and boys to recognise, I can't get a partner, I should be having a partner, I can't get one. How's that happen? Hopefully I can talk a wee bit about that. We mentioned stats and figures, and I need to put my specs on to get a wee bit older. Boys are 50% more likely to fail at the 3 key school subjects, reading, maths and science, by the age of 14. That's from Richard Reeves' books, all about men. 95% of the prison population in Scotland from 2023 is male. That's quoted to figures of around 7,083 men and 390 women in prison in Scotland. Suicide rate. Suicide is the biggest killer of men under the age of 45 in the UK, not just Scotland. So for me, something's going wrong with men. I'm not willing to label it traditional masculinity. Our society's changed, our culture's changed, stuff I've already said, or not economics. We're in a world that is so fluid and so changing just now that what we actually need is to stop labelling and start working with people, particularly young men. We did a piece of research back in 2021 about what does it mean, what does it mean to be a man or a boy in Scotland. From that research, we get a really, really interesting picture. So we surveyed 1,255 young people, not males, not just males, not females, but people of all genders. We also gathered 3 specific focus groups, one for young people as additional support needs, one for people who recognise as lesbian, gay, or LGBTQIT, and one from people from ethnic minorities. But the picture they showed us was very, very different from what we thought it would be. Being a young boy or being a man in Scotland was much more positive than we first thought. Stereotypes and expectations for being a young man in Scotland still exist, but young people don't feel defined by them. Risk-taking behaviours, over half of the people interviewed or took part in the survey had said that they'd been involved in risk-taking behaviours, but hadn't felt peer pressure to do so. 85% of boys and young men felt that there was at least one adult they could trust if they had a problem. And their ideal future, they wanted to own their own home, have a partner, or be married, and have financial security. And that by 2050, they want to live in equal society and not have stereotypes. The reason we found that so interesting is because we've got so many young men failing, as I mentioned earlier on. We've got so many young men in prison, but we've got so many young men taking their own lives. So how do we get from this survey of over 1,000 young people, aged between the ages of 11 and 25, to have a semi-positive idea of the future, to being the biggest killer in a modern society of young men? So for me, there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect between what young people think and believe, and then how they mature into being adults, and what actually reality is like for them in modern culture just now. The young men we've spoken to aren't seeing masculinity as the problem. They're aspirational for a positive future. As I say, it's a disconnect that's harmful for men. That's not saying your traditional masculinity is issue. That's not saying that your modern masculinity is issue. It's around young men, and I think someone mentioned it earlier on. Young men are really, really struggling for their place because our culture has evolved so much that young men are beginning to find, where do I fit? Who am I? My dad went out, worked 75 hours a week, my mum stayed in the house. That's not the norm now. That's not the reality. Who am I? What am I? Where am I going? We're talking about financial insecurity. This guy, John Carmichael's headed up the first ever violence reduction unit in Scotland. His words to me were, Colin, see, we get young men growing up in communities of area, we call them areas of deprivation now. I was born in one and I grew up in one, I lived 30 years in it. And he said, we're bringing young men up in this world that have to fight for everything they want, fight for recognition. I'm surprised they're warriors. And I'm not justifying in any shape, manner or form, as I mentioned earlier, the rise in gender-based violence. But the challenge for me is our previous stereotypes, our previous ways of thinking have siloed men, have siloed women. Can anybody tell me, no, audience participation, can any of you tell me the counter term for feminism? What's the male version? Anybody? Yeah.
Feminism does not mean an equality like for women, it's an equality between genders, therefore it's a time to vote.
I appreciate that, absolutely, but the point for me is we don't have a narrative for that. We don't, masculinityism, don't think I can make that as a word. I saw a really, really interesting podcast recently from Alex Mann, who is the chief executive of Channel 4. And she's on a podcast having a chat about masculinity. And some of the points that Alex raises were really interesting. She'd done a bit of research and said some of the key traits of masculinity are courage, resilience, and competitiveness. And what she then goes on to say is, I think they're positive traits. Yes, I think they're positive traits as well. She said, when I'm working and trying to get more women in leadership roles in the television and production industry, I'm asking them to display those characteristics. So for me, the majority of characteristics that define what we want to say as traditional masculinity, they're positive. The culture, society and structure that we're placing them in just now isn't. That's what we need to tackle, not inherent toxic, not inherent traditional masculinity.
Thank you very much, Colin. And now we will move on to the Q&A section of our evening. If anyone has any questions, I think we know who we're going to go to first. But if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. Like we will go back.
Thank you again. Coming back to what I've said, don't you think that traditional masculinity is reinforced usually by authoritarian sort of ideologies who value intervention within the individual's life? That's a question for opposition.
This has been answered by absolutely anyone as well.
Absolutely, thank you so much for your question. I guess my answer would be not necessarily. Absolutely, there are cases, and you can absolutely see this right now, where authoritarian regimes are preying on a false narrative of what it means to be a man. And they definitely used historical examples for this. There are certain traditions of masculinity that are absolutely part of, or have been victim to, or more commonly associated with authoritarian regimes, but not all of them. And we're not talking about we're not talking about one version of traditional masculinity. We're saying that there are multiple conceptions of this, and the variety is interesting to explore. And while it's an absolutely fair critique of some versions of traditional masculinity, it's not a reason to throw away all the rest of them.
Again, I think we need to be careful. We need to be careful. Masculinity isn't the patriarchy, and it's the patriarchy that controls. And that's what we need to be careful of. That's what we need to tear down. That's what we need to challenge. We have a historical challenge
that men are in power? Absolutely. The more women we can get into leadership roles, the more feminist approaches we can have in that? Absolutely. But we're not going to tear it down in a day. We might not tear it down in 100 years, but as long as we're working towards that, that's nothing to do with masculinity. That's about the patriarchy, that's about power, and that's about control. They're different.
Would the proposition like to reply to that as well? Also, sorry, just to ask, if you're answering a question, can I just ask you to stand so people at the back can see?
So stand up? Okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
Now I feel like asymmetrical. So, I mean, to your question, I think the answer is yes. Okay, there's no historical archive of the different forms of masculinity that exist in indigenous or pre-colonial societies that would give us a litmus test of values to compare with our masculinity. So for 300 years, roughly from the 1700s all the way forward, the arguments about masculinity were specifically tied to Europe. Said differently, if you read Oyewumi's Invention of Woman, she explains that in Central Africa there's not even a word for gender. They don't even have a word for masculinity or femininity. So it's, you know, in this kind of audience, it's interesting because the intuition is to look at your own society as your own life. But when you actually compare what other groups of people have grammatically in terms of their language and linguistics, historically in terms of their myths, notions of men and masculinity don't come out prior. The predominant feature of European Western societies is sexual division. So, said differently, in the words of Connor, you didn't just take away people's land, you encroached upon their culture. And you've introduced your own language and grammar of masculinity, femininity, gender, etc. to designate certain groups of people. So there is no definition of masculinity that existed in these countries and cultures that did not accompany genocide, colonialism, and imperialism. That's just a historical fact. So what we're trying to do in decolonizing this is to reclaim some of those origin stories. So we have to be careful about how we want to talk about terms within our language and then attribute that to other groups of people, especially when much of the University of Edinburgh, especially my department, was dedicated to making sure that you knew these people were savages and could never be civilized men and women. Right? We just have to be historically accurate.
Thank you very much. We will go with you, but you also have a speech, maybe later. We'll see how it goes. I apologise for that. But there's a hand straight at the back over there. So you'll get your 10,000 steps in this year.
I have a question for the opposition. You've claimed that traditional masculinity is at odds with toxic masculinity. I would argue that in the context of this question, that doesn't necessarily matter because toxic masculinity traditional masculinity spawns toxic masculinity. In the analogy of the roots being blamed for rotten apples, perhaps roots are blamed in situations where they shouldn't be, but if one tree continually produces more rotten apples than another, then there is some problem with that tree. If every instance of some proponent of toxic masculinity aligns themselves with traditional masculinity, why can't we just accept that traditional masculinity is causing the problem, and even if it isn't the problem, that needs to be addressed?
I think first of all I want to reiterate this idea of Aristotle's doctrine of means where, even these good values can be corrupted. And I take your point that, we seem to see in the media and stuff like that a lot of corruption in masculinity. But I think it's also much easier to highlight these corruptions than perhaps the good effects of masculinity. Every day we see people being courageous for the little things, standing up for the small person, working hard, all these traits that perhaps aren't as flashy, perhaps aren't as headlining as these much worse things that happen. I also maybe draw a different analogy. My grandparents are Muslims, and they kind of lived their whole life in service. They're telling me about how to be peaceful, how to help people, stuff like that. But equally, you have people who take Islamic scripture and become terrorists and extremists. And I know this happens across across other religions too, but let's just take Islam for an example. You know, off of these headlines of Islamic extremists, do we then say that Islam is a dangerous religion that incites hate and stuff like that? Or do we look at, you know, the majority of people who take Islam as a peaceful religion, as a religion for good and service, and, you know, base it more on that?
I think in response to that, I'd like to say I'm getting completely fed up with this entire debate. I think everything that we've been saying about the definition of a man has gone nowhere. I think no one's going to leave here today knowing what a man is and what a man should be. We're saying that men are courageous. Why can no one else be courageous? Why is that not a human quality? And I think the issue we're getting to here is that manhood should not be a thing at all. Womanhood should not be a thing at all. There is the fact that there's biology, yes, some people have penises, some people have vaginas. The floor speech person meant that men have more testosterone. Not all men. There are a large percentage of women who have more testosterone than a large percentage of men. There are also about 2% of the population who are intersex and don't fit into these two categories. Yes, it makes some sense that, you know, some people have this biology, some people that, but it's not one or the other. It's not truly binary. You're artificially simplifying the science. For example, and this is why it's a tool for control. If you look at when Spain colonized Latin America, they put everyone into these different racial groups: black, white, colored, mulatto, mestizo, all of these different ones to separate and create these categories to make people that are valued and people that are not valued. And this is what they've done with men and women, and this is the case for traditional masculinity. If we could just not have it ever, trans people wouldn't need to exist because there's nothing that they would be limited from if there was no men and no women in the first place. Gay men wouldn't be gay men, they would just be people. And I think that's the real crux here. We can't find anything out in this debate because there's nothing to find out in the first place.
I couldn't agree more. But I think you're arguing for our opposition to the statement that traditional masculinity is harming men. It's not about traditional masculinity, it's about the constructs we have around that in terms of male, female. What we're saying is that the aspects of traditional masculinity aren't in themselves toxic or challenging or down on people. It's the way it's being used in modern society that means that we're not supporting people to be the best they can be. So as far as that, I'll maybe not make myself clear. How do I make myself clear? Toxic masculinity is a modern construct. When did you first hear about toxic masculinity? 5, 10 years ago? It's a construct. Our argument is that to completely define traditional masculinity as a problem for men is false. And I think that's what you're just articulating.
Thank you very much. Yeah, go on then. Since your hand went straight. Oh yeah. Sorry, we want to run your reply.
Maybe just very quickly.
Yeah, I think just for the sake, we want to hear as many questions as possible. We'll move on. Yeah, your hand thing goes on then.
I'm disappointed to find that you're still agreeing with each other. So, I'm going to attempt to bridge something I think is potentially talking past each other with a question to Mr. McFarlane. I have to apologise because I'm about to ask you an academic question, and your priority is on people's actual lives. And I think that's a much higher priority than what I'm about to ask you. But it seems to be the case that we've heard from the proposition that the term of masculinity is something that is bound up with the society that you've identified as the problem, leaving men behind. And your fellow kind of opposers, the remainder of your team, seems to be defending the thing that you are also opposed to, which is a way of thinking about being a man that is so framed by a society that leaves behind actually a useful way of explaining what the good thing is of being a man. Which means that there is a disagreement here between some aspects of the proposition, which is troubling the entire notion of maleness as a useful category, and something of the opposition, which wants to retain that there is such a thing to be a man. And if you guys can disagree on nothing else, disagree on something, on that, because there are two competing notions here of how we move forward. If we're agreed on the idea that traditional masculinity, or the term masculinity, which I think you've understandably demonstrated is something that is not helpful to us in articulating the goods of being male, do we then persist in articulating that there are goods to being male? Is there something to be a man that is worth preserving? Picture a question we can disagree on.
I'd just like to quickly say, usually our questions are shorter, and Mr. McFarlane has a bit of a task ahead of him, but I'm sure he'll
So yes, thanks for reaffirming I'm not an academic. And I mean that positively. We're not arguing that all the traits of masculinity are positive, definitely. There are some real challenges that men face in managing behaviours, expectations, etc. I think what we're trying to say is that calling it traditional masculinity and bringing that into our modern culture doesn't fit. It doesn't work. Our societies change, our cultures change, all the stuff I mentioned earlier on. The world is so different. But should we not reinforce with young people that courage is great and courage in women is great? You look at the suffragette women, how courageous and brave were they? You look at men going to war, how courageous and brave are they? It's not a great thing to do, but it's courageous and brave. So if you look at the dictionary definition of masculinity, courage and bravery are parts of that. Resilience is a part of that. Do we not want to bring our young people up to be resilient? Male, female, all gender and none. We want them to be resilient. So why should we say that that's harming men in the modern world? I don't think it is. The key point is that there are certain traits of being a man that is great. There are certain traits of being a man that can be distorted, that was mentioned earlier on, can be taken down completely wrong avenues. But I could say the same about feminism and women. I've met some quite toxic females in my life, but I don't want to label them. What I want to say is that there are good and bad in all of us. There's toxic and great in all of us. And to actually say that inherently, that the inherent things that are making you masculine are more harming modern men, I just think it's unfounded. I don't agree with it at all. So I hope that answers your point in a semi-academic way.
Let me be super quick, okay? There's no documented form of toxic masculinity. Even R.W.S. Canal says this is a false thing that got swept up by young people in the late 20th century, early 21st century about men's behavior. That's not what hegemonic masculinity is. That's not what it does. What I find interesting about this conversation, though, is we're constantly provoking what does it mean to be male? What does it mean to have a traditional masculinity that has good values? And what I guess I'm trying to explain as the professor here is that, for God's sakes, at least have some evidence behind what you're saying. Listen, here's how toxic the imperial culture of Europe is. You're asking for notions of goodness in a society that thought no one else could possess the traits that you're trying to say are good. No one else. Nobody was a woman. Nobody was a man. No one was a human for most of human history following the Scottish Enlightenment. So now what you're doing is saying, okay, well, sure, we need to help boys. I completely understand that. My research is on boys, admit it, right? But traditional masculinity isn't what it does. For example, if you look at how certain groups of men support gender equality, take the United States. Black men have the highest support of gender equality in voting, working outside the home, and holding political office than every other group of people, including black women, in the country. That data has been around for 30 years. So when you put other groups of men in the same conditions that poor Scottish boys are suffering from, they don't have the same kind of values. Cultures change what masculinity or maleness is, what manhood means. So what we're doing in this conversation is saying, well, what are the good bits and pieces of this, right? That we could have courageous and strong women from the suffragist movement, who themselves were colonialists and imperialists, who kill people. If you read Cellar James, cut babies from people's stomachs. Like, this is what I mean about the context. You don't have the privilege, this is the professor part, you don't have the privilege of being ignorant about what your own history is committed. So when you speak about the terms of masculinity and femininity, put them in the context of what the country, the ground, the culture has created for it. They're extremely courageous people that were fighting against colonialism. There are extremely courageous people, men and women, who are fighting against enslavement, right? There are people in your country today that are fighting against xenophobia, and for God's sakes, whatever Farage is doing, okay? Those are courageous people, men and women, but can you put them in the same boat, traditional masculine? Their values of revolt come from some other place, right? So what we have to remember, right, is that masculinity, as it was defined historically, is the problem because of the context. It came about in guns, it came about in imperialism, it came about in genocide. Same thing with feminism. It came about for women's rights, in the sense they want to colonize, own property, own slaves if you're in America. Right? For God's sakes, have that much wherewithal to know what we're arguing about. And then in that context, ask yourself the question, do you want to support a value, right, that depends on the dehumanization of other people? Right?
Tommy, some amazing points, and I would not even go anywhere near trying to argue with you, seriously. But the challenge I have is reality. So there might not be anything about toxic masculinity and research or evidence, but the young men I'm working with just now, and the young men I've been working with over the last 5 years, it's a reality. That's who they are, that's how they're labelled, that's how they're defined by society. And if we continue to have this toxic narrative and don't have a counter-argument, I would ask you, why are there no positive male role models out there? Or why are there very few male role models out there? Because they're frightened. They're scared to put their head above the parapet to say, I'm a positive man, I'm a healthy man, because they're frightened of getting shot down by our society, by our press, by our public. That's what we need to change. Because if we continue in the vein that we're in just now, we're going to grow more incels. We're going to grow more toxic young men. Because right now, the society they're living in, they're fighting for everything they can get. So we need to change that narrative and do something different.
Ask a question of the proposition. Yeah, go on. Well, where's this answer?
Hi, okay, so I think my question is for second speaker. Because in your speech, you talked a lot about kind of just like masculinity and gender norms as a whole, which are like bad and blah, blah, blah. And like, okay, in a world without that, right? A world where we don't have that and where anyone can kind of just be who they are without the social constructs involved, which is generally something that I do like believe in. I still think that when you come to the present then, we get into this situation where we still need some sort of thing that allows people to ground themselves in how they act and speak and behave and like what they do, how they dress, kind of like all of these sort of things that like help form identity that doesn't exist if you just have nothing and then people kind of maybe are a little lost. I think this then gets into this whole point where like even when we condemn traditional masculinity, society still expects men to be traditionally masculine, and men still see this, and so we get into this point where like they're not entirely sure of like who they are and what they want to be going forward, and this drives the male identity crisis and suicide rates and et cetera, et cetera. So my question for the proposition is then, okay, we reject traditional masculinity as a harm. What next? Like, what do we do then to help build a better society? Because I'm not entirely sure if I've gotten a clear answer on that.
So I understand that you think that if we didn't have that, it would be difficult for people to form their own identities. I think the first thing I'd like to say to that is that there are a lot of people who are currently excluded from being able to form their own identities by the binary that we've got. Trans people, for example, are forced out of their own will to fix what isn't there presently for them because of the society that we've built up. It doesn't suit them. Non-binary people, it doesn't suit them. So I think by arguing for the marginalised people it's quite good is damaging for everyone else. It means that it shouldn't be this thing that's just accepted because it works kind of well. There are so many other things that provide us our identity, our humanity to begin with. When Colin is talking about the courageous men and the brave men, why can't it just be brave people, courageous people? And when you look at the exact sources of our masculinity and our femininity, it comes from places of trying to create a system of control, a system of maintaining order in a way that is beneficial to power, not people. If instead we didn't have this, we would still be able to form our own identities. If you look at how masculinity is changing, it's going away from the idea that you must be this or that, and people are flourishing from that. Identities are changing rapidly and wonderfully, and I think it's a good thing. But if we stick to the idea that there is one or the other, it limits so much creativity, so much. I'm just saying that you're saying it's going to limit people's identity, but I completely disagree with you. I think it'll do the opposite. Thank you.
Okay, you asked us to disagree about something, for God's sake, and I disagree. I think this question of what is the future of gender, and does any kind of gender categorization have any place in this world? Is there any help from it? I think it's a fascinating and a complex one, and I don't have the answer. But I do think that you're saying, let us establish this label-less world. Let us have complete freedom. Let us not exclude the people that have been excluded by gender binary for so long. And I agree with that. But I also think that you are saying all traditional masculinity is bad. And by saying that, you are limiting a whole range of gender expressions that should be available to all people, regardless of their gender identity. But allowing us to label this as traditional masculinity, while maybe a term that we should discover and assess in literature, it is a somewhat productive way to go forward. Because when you have a labelless society, when you have no identity categorizations, it's much harder to analyze and understand people's lived experiences. Right now, at this point in time, the experience of a trans man is very different to that of a cis woman, for example. Those labels, while they are something to examine, they are something to question, are helpful in being able to understand those experiences. And I think that there is a world where we have some categorizations of gender, some gender expressions, some gendered terms, and that's not 100% harmful.
Yeah, just one thing. The proposition's, why can't women be courageous? And exactly, why can't women be courageous? I think what's important here is that we're saying that these terms of masculinity and femininity, they don't have to be seen in the same gendered way that they have throughout history. They can be marker points. You don't have to have a man that's fully masculine. You don't have to have a woman that's fully feminine. They almost give you a line in which you can find yourself, and I think that's really important in this debate.
This will be our last question. Someone in a black tie, just there. Yeah, fantastic. So, and can we make the question and answers brief, just because we're running out of time, but I do want to hear from you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring a point to the table that I think is relevant to both the opposition and the proposition, and that is a question of definition. So, with feminism this time, I have to try and define masculinity again. Feminism, while it's a term that it was originally used to describe a predominantly white, middle-class and cisgender battle for equality, is now, when it's talked about intersectionally, which the majority of the time is used to describe gender equality regardless of class, regardless of race, regardless of whether you're cisgender or trans. And that is something that I think has been sort of disputed. So I want to ask, do you have a problem with, most of the opposition, do you have a problem with the actual concept behind feminism, the gender equality at the root of it, and an fundamentally intersectional gender equality? Or do you have a problem with the term feminism? Do you think that that's too loaded and that it excludes, particularly in this case relevant to the debate, men, and that this isolates them and perpetuates harmful stereotypes about society? And it also then excludes trans people and racial minorities by extension of that. And then also, do you think that we need, how do we progress from here? Do we need a new term? Is this what is limiting?
Sorry, just because of time, I appreciate that you want to continue. Does anyone from the opposition want to go short on that one? I know those are complicated questions.
I think you're reinforcing the point I made earlier. There is no other male term for feminism. Feminism is not a male or a female dominated agenda, but it's been turned into a binary agenda. So feminism and culturally is around women. I think that's wrong. Feminism can work for anybody in society, as you mentioned. The reason I asked is if it was a male term is, how do you sell it? Because at the end of the day, we're going to have to sell a feminine approach to men. If we want to make men accountable for gender-based violence, we need to change it from being a woman's issue to a man's issue, because men are the perpetrators. The problem we have is we're not allowed to have that discourse. The way the structures have been set up, we can't have the discourse between men and women to make this a male gender-based violence, as I said, is a male issue. So feminism approach for all genders and none, I think, is the only way that we get forward with the terms around heredity or traditional masculinity. I think that's spot on.
Yeah, go ahead. Just once again, decently. I know it's a big question. Yeah, go ahead.
Again, I think I'd like to talk about categorization. And we're categorizing known as, well, we firstly said that feminism is like strictly in this one direction. That's just the way that the English language is done. And that's specific to our culture. For example, in Spanish, you have machismo for men, feminismo, equal, and hembraísmo for women. And it's not just the English language that controls it in that way. So when English we see feminism, we think, oh, for women, and everything else is different, but it means equality, like you said. But if you just get away from categorizing things in these ways, it would be entirely beneficial. You were saying we need to have gender expressions to understand what other people are going through, but why can't we just have expressions? Why can't we just do the things that we do as human beings and leave everything else behind? Now, gender expressions, roles, the creation of categories and types, and things that are good and bad, means that people can be coded and put down. When, for example, men who were gay, or there were creations of types of men who were the homosexuals or the perverts, and things were connected together in ways that they shouldn't have been because they were able to make these categories up. And similar with the feminism point, similar with the trans point, we've made up categories which have harmed people, and in the eventual end of it, racism as well, you're creating categories like my point about Spanish colonialism that are unnecessary and damaging. Even if there's that slight benefit of being able to understand it, it would be better to not understand the complexity of everyone and everything if it just means that we can't put on the damage that is inevitably going to happen. Thank you.
I think with that we will finish our Q&A section and move on to the summation speeches. We will start with the first speaker for the opposition. Anna, if you would just like to summarise the debate for us and the opposition.
Tonight, the proposition had the duty to prove to us that traditional masculinity, in the full sense of that term, is actually harming men in society. But in refusing to acknowledge that there is an evolving set of values, and traditional masculinity truly presents variety and choice, and that denying that and the very real benefits it provides to real, actual lived experience, and denying the fact that there is a healthy and flexible version of traditional masculinity, they have failed to do this. Masculinity is not inherently toxic, and there is no one tradition of masculinity that we should hold ourselves to. When linking masculinity to tradition, why not look to positive representations of manhood, of self-control, of moral action, of duty, and care for those around us? Professor Curry, first of all, I thought I would be the fastest talker tonight, and I wasn't, so thank you. You've very successfully convinced me of the problematic intersection of racism and our definition of masculinity. And I think this is a particularly overlooked intersection that is a very valid point in understanding how we are conceptualizing this term and the very foundations of it. However, I do not think that you've successfully convinced us that this one conception, this one European conception that is tainted by colonialism and imperialism and incredibly vile acts, is the only definition of masculinity that we should be acknowledging. What about the traditions of masculinity in those societies that you're talking about being subjugated? What about those traditions of masculinity that are in the 160 matrilineal societies? Just because we don't study those, maybe there's a gap in the literature there, doesn't mean that those are not traditions that are of masculinity that are valid to explore.
I think so we've had a very productive debate tonight. I think the opposition has tried to emphasize the nuances and the flexibility that comes with masculinity, and above all, prove that masculinity is not all that, and that there is a place in today's society for some version of masculinity, and that limiting that choice to everyone is fundamentally flawed. Thank you very much.
To summarise the argument for the proposition, may we welcome once again Casper Hewlett.
Thank you. That's a lot to talk about and think about, I have to say. That, as Ryan, who gave a very good speech about us disagreeing with each other, said, we do need to disagree, and I'm going to disappoint him, sadly, that we still are going to have to disagree on this definition. Because as Dr. Curry very well set out, that this definition is the only one that we, or academics, are working with. It is the one that is true and has been true for the last 300 years of European history. So what I don't like is the idea of the opposition slightly muddying the water with different definitions and trying to mix in sort of 21st century ideals and sort of view history through that lens and trying to sort of paint this almost an idealistic view of the sort of the principles of traditional masculinity. Like, for example, the first opposition speaker, second opposition speaker, presents a very romanticised view of these traditional masculine ideals that are sort of perennial throughout society and throughout history. But I'd say the reality is a lot darker. So you mentioned some concepts like chivalry that one would agree is positive, but if you look at the medieval period, things like chivalry were used to justify rape and sexual conquest. This is a very, again, an ideal that the opposition are sort of trying to call to as something inherently good, yet I don't think the history speaks to that, and that is the issue. I would also like to refer to the third opposition speaker, because you made a very, very good point about just young men being left behind, and I think that is incredibly true, and I'm not going to sort of counter that too much, but I will sort of emphasise what was mentioned on the floor, these ideas of, well, who did set that up? Because if we look at who's actually responsible, is it, society sort of changing, or is it the fact that there are these, lingering expectations and pressures on how men should be that are making them feel purposeless, lost, etc. You referenced that 80% of boys in Scotland have a positive view of masculinity, of traditional masculinity, that is. Then what is the problem? Then what is actually causing that? And it seems that it's sort of an economic one. So it seems to be that actually, if you were to reinforce traditional masculine ideals, then would it actually cause that much of a difference to their lives and feeling more purposeful? It seems to me that they've got an expectation and pressure on them to be a certain way, to be a man from the traditional sense, and they feel like they are falling short of that. And I think that is what is causing those issues. In my speech, I do reference a lot of studies, and everyone on our side has referenced a lot of studies and historical data, etc. And we make no apology for that, because these are important, because they show what we have been saying the whole time, that these traits, as we have defined, that are set out by R.W. Connell, are what traditional masculinity is and has been historically. That is black and white in our eyes. And that is what is harming men. And these stats that we are bringing up in these studies that show, the suicide rate, the idea of sort of men feeling disaffected or unable to sort of articulate their emotions or feeling they have to close in, that is evidence that those traditional expectations are the ones that are the damaging ones and should be rejected. Just to sort of finish quickly, like I said, evidence is key, and I believe as the proposition we have provided that, and I don't want the proposition to muddy the water by sort of separating the debate into something completely different, because by the definition of the motion, we have answered it. And so I don't want you to walk away with this, from this debate chamber having not voted based on what the motion is. We can have healthy masculinity, that is absolutely fine, but that is not traditional masculinity, and that is what the motion says. So I urge you to vote for the proposition. Thank you.
That's quite a nice segue for me to move into the voting. The way that we vote here at Edinburgh Union is with our feet. And so, as you can see by the example, if you leave through that door, you'll be voting for the proposition. If you leave through this door, you will be voting for the opposition. We also, I'm sure that there are many thoughts and many considerations going through your mind. If you wish to have a more social aspect afterwards and potentially meet some of our fantastic speakers and continue speaking about this topic, we will be heading over to the wonderful wash bar where we'll all be having a pint. So hopefully I'll see you there. Thank you very much for coming, and please have a great evening.